It's good to see everybody again, like I said earlier. As we're getting ready to come into this Easter, Passover season. The next 3 Sundays I'm going to be looking at different points of the Easter story. And today, the sermon I'm preaching, which probably traditionally be preached next Sunday, because it's what we call the triumphal entry of Jesus, which is Palm Sunday. And that's next Sunday actually, but because of timing and everything, I need to look at it today. And I'm going to compare and contrast it to another event. Back in 1 Chronicles, in the Old Testament, where David was bringing the Ark of the Covenant into Jerusalem. First Chronicles 13 and 1 Chronicles 15, 11 through 29, and 2 Samuel chapter 6. I'm not going to really read these stories, but just kind of give an overview of them. The 2 Samuel chapter 6 has, in the whole chapter, it tells both stories of the 1 Chronicles. 1 Chronicles 13 is where they first loaded onto a brand new ox cart and are hauling it. They get by a threshing floor, and Uzzah reaches out to steady the ark because they hit a big rut or some type of something in the road, and they said the oxen shook the cart, but it made the cart seem like it was about to tip over, and so Uzzah reached out and touched the ark to steady it so it wouldn't fall out. And as we know, Uzzah was killed from the wrath of God, because only Levites were supposed to carry the ark, and even they couldn't touch it unless they had been purified and they were using the specific poles were being used to carry it. Nobody was allowed to touch the ark, or else you would die, as Uzzah did. And so, this first story, David had decided as king to bring the ark back into Jerusalem. And didn't that happen, so they left it at a person's house to be watched over. And David went back, and he is there for about 3 months. And after he received word from the Lord on how to properly carry and transport the ark, did he go back and do it. First point of that story is David was trying to move the ark on his own. They did not consult with the Lord to see if the Lord wanted it moved. They did not consult with the Lord to see how to move it. They just moved it. Then 1 Chronicles 15, 11 through 29, they relate the story. David goes back after he's received word from the Lord, and he's gotten in touch and told the Levitical people, the descendants of Aaron, of how they were to be dressed and purified, and who was going to be carrying it, who was going to be musicians, who was going to be singers, and broke it all down for them. And only then, once they were all ready, did they go and get the Ark of the Covenant and bring it back to Jerusalem. Bring it into Jerusalem. And we all know that David was dancing with joy, and he was really getting into it, getting into his dancing, if you read it. You know, so much so his wife, the daughter of Saul, had disdain for David because of the way he was dancing and his state of dress during the dance. But David was celebrating, bringing the object that represented the presence of God to Jerusalem. At that time, for the Israelites, the Ark of the Covenant is what represented God's presence. And it had not been within the nation of Israel in the tabernacle for over 100 years prior to David bringing it to Jerusalem. It had been captured in a war by the Philistines, and we know that the Philistines had a lot of sickness and illnesses with it because they had captured it and it wasn't theirs. And they made gold objects and sent that back along with the ark as restitution for having taken it. But the ark wound up in Kiriath Jearim, as you read in the First Chronicle stories, and it was there for over 100 years because the leaders of Israel, the judges, and some of those were not fully committed followers like it was set up when Moses and they led the Israelites out of Egypt. And David had also made Jerusalem as a neutral city. And he had made it the political capital of Israel. And by bringing the ark in, he also made it the religious center of their life also. And so Jerusalem, that's why everybody looks to Jerusalem now. That's where the ark is, or was. We don't know where it is now. But Jerusalem is the religious center of Israel. Then, at the time David brought the ark to Israel, it says that when they first left the house, they walked 6 paces, 6 steps. And they had a sacrifice. This is the second time. They brought it out 6 paces. David offered a sacrifice to God, thanking him for being able to do that. And then they carry it all the way into Jerusalem with the instruments playing. Think of it as a big fanfare parade that we would have today, like a team or somebody won, even though that's not a good comparison. But, you know, we're celebrating a big event of some type. Well, David, he gets to Jerusalem, and they set it in the tabernacle that David had built for the ark. David offers a burnt offering and a peace offering, which you can read about back in the book of Exodus and Deuteronomy. And he blessed the people of Israel. And one of the things he did on this, through this blessing, is he gave everybody a piece of bread, or a cake of bread, depending on which translations you read. Some of them say a piece of flesh or a piece of meat, a bottle of wine, Other translations say a cake of raisins and a cake of dates, kind of a sweet, but David gave them food as a blessing because God had returned to their nation. The representation of God was within their midst again. And he gave it as a celebration gift and a blessing to the people. Now, let's compare that to New Testament, to Jesus' triumphal entry. And part of this kind of leapfrogs into next week's message, but because of Palm Sunday and everything, but the way I've got to do it. All four Gospels tell the story of Jesus coming into Jerusalem in what we call the triumphal entry. And that's in Matthew 21, 1 through 17, Mark 11, 1 through 11, Luke 19, 29 through 40, and John 12, 12 through 19. Matthew, Mark, and Luke give more of a detailed account of the triumphal entry, where it talks about he instructed a couple of the disciples to go in and find the donkey and its colt and bring them to him for him to ride in. And John is the only one that mentions palms. The others talk about leafy branches and things like that, but they don't use the word palm. So John is where we get the word palm from, where we get Palm Sunday. Is because that is the day you recognize Jesus rode in on a donkey. The street was covered with palms. People were waving palms. And not only that, the people were singing and celebrating, just like it was back in 2 Samuel and the 1 Chronicles. They brought the ark in with singing and musical instruments playing. The people did the same thing when Jesus rode into town. And just like David brought the ark in, the presence of God into Jerusalem, and sacrificed to the Lord, so was Jesus. Jesus was entering Jerusalem to become the ultimate sacrifice for us. David gave the people bread, meat, and wine to bless each household. Well, Jesus gave his body, his flesh, which is represented by the bread, which we're going to observe here shortly, and his blood, which is represented by the wine or grape juice that we drink, as the ultimate and final sacrifice. By Jesus giving of his body freely, giving of his flesh freely, he ends the Davidic covenant, the Mosaic law of having to sacrifice. But by doing it freely, he enters into the new covenant with us. And as we observe his the Last Supper, what we call the Last Supper, observing is giving the bread, which represents his body, his flesh, and his blood, which represents the Jews, represents his blood. And so, if it had not been for that act, then we would still be under the sacrificial laws, having to sacrifice. But because Jesus freely gave his body, and that's what part of this season is about, is his sacrifice. And by him riding into Jerusalem, becoming the sacrifice, instead of humans offering sacrifice, he became the sacrifice. And both times, all the people were rejoicing, praising God, and shouting Hosanna. And so, as we get ready to observe the Lord's Supper here, I want us to think about that sacrifice and remember what Jesus did for us, and thank him for doing it, and thank him because through the rest of the Easter, the rest of the Acts that we're looking at these next 2 Sundays, seeing everything that he did through 1 week to give us salvation that we enjoy today.